So again, it's just a few of us. Thankful to have a couple extras with us tonight. Offset a few that we got missing. That's nice. We are thankful how the Lord has blessed and the Lord has allowed us to be here. It is hard to believe that we are coming up on 5-year mark. Time flies. But the Lord has blessed and opened doors, and we've had visitors almost every Wednesday and almost every Sunday for quite a while now, and so thankful for that. But pray for us as we continue to seek the Lord's will here. We need to be thinking about renewing or not renewing, or if we're not going to renew, what are we going to do? So those are some things that we need to be praying about. So continue to pray for those things if you would. Now, we sang this song, Victory Ahead, and it gives a few examples, right, of when the host of Israel, led by God, round the walls of Jericho softly trod, right? They were trusting in the Lord. The Lord gave them this command to do this thing, and it didn't make any practical sense. It didn't make any sense from what we could piece together, right? But they did it because that's what God said to do. David, with a shepherd's sling and 5 stones, met the giant on the field all alone, trusting in the Lord, right? Now, in that case, we don't necessarily see where the Lord specifically told David, now go do this, right? But David saw it, and he knew what was right, and he knew what needed to be done. And he went out, even though it looked like from a physical perspective he couldn't win this battle. But he did, because the Lord was with him, right? And he had faith, and he trusted in the Lord. And he saw that the Lord could provide victory, right? We have many accounts of that in the Bible. I think about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, right, as they stood before the fiery furnace. And I love the fact that they trusted that the Lord would deliver them, but they even said, even if he don't, right? That's faith. That's trust. We see here in the song, Daniel prayed unto the Lord thrice each day, then into the lion's den led the way. Trusting in the Lord, he did not fear or dread, right? Again, you see Daniel doing something, even though he knew it was likely to get him in trouble, but he knew it was the right thing to do, and he did it, right? That's trusting in the Lord. Trusting in the Lord no matter where it leads, no matter where it goes, no matter how it turns out, right? In those examples, we see that. It may not make practical sense, but God said to do it that way, and so that's what we're going to do. We don't know how it's going to turn out. Maybe we survive and maybe we don't, but that's what we're going to do because that's what God desires and that's what God wants. And trusting in him regardless of the outcome. Now, that does go along very well with the lesson that we're going to do tonight. This is going to be a part 2. Last Sunday night, we went through the book of Psalms, or the chapter 64 of the book of Psalms. We've been going through one psalm every Sunday night for quite a while now. And Psalms chapter 64 really stood out to me because oftentimes what we've been trying to do when we go through the book of Psalms is when it's a psalm written by David, we either go back and try to find that event that David was writing about, because oftentimes the superscriptions above them or even the content of the story will tell us. And those psalms, to me anyways, have jumped out so much more when you look at them not just as the psalm, but you actually go read what happened in the book of 1st and 2nd Samuel. You read about what David was going through and the things that Saul did to him or the things that Absalom did to him or those things. And you look at those in the context of something that literally happened. This is not just that he sat down and wrote an uplifting song, but literally he was writing oftentimes either during or right after or later about something that had actually happened in his life and how he had seen the Lord take a bad situation and turn it around. Now, when it comes to Psalms chapter 64, I don't necessarily know I don't know that there's necessarily a particular story in David's life that I could point to. There are some, right? He talks about those that are taking secret counsel and they're trying to ambush the righteous. I think there are multiple psalms that have been written about some times when, some of David's trusted people betrayed him, or when his own family betrayed him, right? And so we could talk about those times. But last time, we didn't do that. We read Psalm chapter 64, and I asked everybody to think about times in the Old Testament or the New Testament where they could think of a story that fit really well within Psalm chapter 64. So for those that weren't here on Sunday night, let me read this real quick, and I'll show you a few points about this psalm. And then I'll tell you the story we covered last Sunday, and then we'll pick up with a second story that we referred to last time but didn't really have time to get into. Psalm chapter 64 says this: "Hear my voice, O God, in my prayer, and preserve my life from fear of the enemy. Hide me from the secret counsel of the wicked and from the insurrection of the workers of iniquity." Now, I'm not going to re-preach last Sunday's message, but really quickly, he is going here to the Lord in prayer, and he is asking the Lord to hear him. But as he does that, he asks the Lord for a few things. Preserve me, right? Lord, preserve me from the fear of the enemy. Now, that's interesting. He didn't say preserve me from the enemy. He said preserve my life from fear of the enemy. And then he says in verse 2, hide me from the secret counsel of the wicked, right? Those that are secretly conspiring. And then he says from the insurrection of the workers of iniquity. I talked about last time that word insurrection brings with it the idea of a tumultuous crowd. We would use the word mob, right? So a mob of workers of iniquity. That verse, he's asking the Lord to help him from both those that are taking secret counsel and the loud, boisterous mob, right? So both of them he's asking for protection of. He says, who whet their tongue like a sword and bend their bows to shoot their arrows, even bitter words, that they may shoot in secret at the perfect. Suddenly do they shoot at him and fear not. They encourage themselves in an evil matter. They commune of laying snares privately. They say, who shall see them? They search out iniquities. They accomplish a diligent search. Both the inward thought of every one of them and the heart is deep. In verses 3 down through verse 6, you see several things. They are using their tongues and their words as weapons, right? They already taken secret counsel, or maybe they're a loud, boisterous mob, but this is premeditated. To whet your tongue like a sword would be the idea of to sharpen it, right, in preparation for making it more destructive, right? And then it says that they bend their bows to shoot their arrows. You also found in verse 4 that they're doing this from ambush, that they shoot in secret at the perfect. Suddenly do they shoot at him. And we talked about last time, poor Elliot was sitting here in the front row, and I kept drawing my bow back and pointing at him. He kept trying to get out away from it. And I finally told him, well, in this case, you wouldn't even know I was pointing it at you because it was done in secret, right? It was done in secret. They are out to ambush him. They're encouraging themselves in an evil matter. You got this wicked group of people, and they've plotted and they've planned, and they're setting up this ambush, and they're uplifting each other, right? They're encouraging each other. They're prompting each other, is what you see in this. They encourage themselves in an evil matter. They commune of laying snares. They plan out, where are we going to put this one? How are we going to arrange this one? How can we get them to fall into this trap, right? You see these guys laying out these snares. And then when they're all done, they say, we're going to be successful because who saw us and who's going to see our traps, right? They're going to fall into these traps. Who can see this? The confidence that they have here. And then in verse 6, they search out iniquities. Man, they go on the hunt for what they can do, right? These are some wicked people. They search out iniquities. They accomplish a diligent search. Man, they put the work and the energy and the effort into this. Both the inward thought of every one of them and the heart is deep. This is no shallow thing that they're doing. This goes down to their core, right? They've encouraged themselves. They've plotted. They've planned. They've done all this. They did a diligent search. This is something they have put a lot of thought and effort into. You're getting a picture of the enemies that David is talking about here. It says, though, in verse 7, "But God shall shoot at them with an arrow. Suddenly shall they be wounded." Who was it that was drawing their bow earlier? Right? Who drew the bow? The evil people, right? And they're in ambush, arrow drawn, ready to fire. But then God lets loose his arrow. It says in verse 8, "So they shall make their own tongue to fall upon themselves." How was their tongue referred to earlier? They were whetting it like a sword. And now we find that when God lets loose his arrow, their own words fall upon themselves. That phrase there, that it falls upon them, is also that picture of a sword that's coming upon them, right? Sudden, and all that see them shall flee away, and all men shall fear and shall declare the work of God, for they shall wisely consider his doing. We talked about last time how that when these wicked people that have done this, they've plotted, they've planned, and then God lets loose on them, God's judgment comes upon them. Those that are standing around and see it, they are going to go, "That's God. God did that." And they're going to fear, and they're going to take notice of what God has done. In verse 10, "The righteous shall be glad in the Lord, and shall trust in him, and all the upright in heart shall glory." Now, as you think about that story, right, they're taking secret counsel, they're using their words, they're plotting, they're planning, they're setting up ambushes and all of these other things. But then God turns the table on them, and the very things that they had planned as destruction for the children of God turn out to be their own destruction. Now, the stories that we thought of last time, one of them we went in great depth, was the story of Esther. When you think about Haman, right, and how Mordecai would not bow to him, and that drove him so nuts that, like, it wasn't good enough to just destroy Mordecai. He needed to destroy all of his people. And he plotted and he planned and he did all this. And by the time it was done, he was leading Mordecai through the street saying, "This is what we do to somebody that the king desires to honor," the day after he had built a gallows to hang Mordecai on. And by the time it's done, the king has him hung on his own gallows, right? That is a really good example of what David's talking about in Psalms chapter 64. The other one we referenced and briefly talked about but didn't have time to go read the chapter was Daniel in the lion's den, right? It's another good example. It's actually, the more I read it this week, the more I realized at a surface level, it's a good example. It's even a better example than I was thinking of even at first. So let's just go ahead and turn to Daniel chapter 6, and we'll read this tonight. Daniel chapter 6, starting in verse 1. It says, "It pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 princes, which should be over the whole kingdom, and over these 3 presidents, of whom Daniel was first, that princes might give accounts unto them, and the king should have no damage. Then this Daniel was preferred above the presidents and princes, because an excellent spirit was in him, and the king thought to set him over the whole realm." As you see this, Daniel, of course, is originally a captive, but he has set himself up, and he has been proven wise, and he has done so much in the kingdom, and he is set in a place of honor. And the kingdom is laid out under different princes, and he's a president. There's 3 presidents. He seems to be the chief among those. And it describes Daniel as having an excellent spirit. So much so that the king sought to maybe just even set the whole realm over under Daniel. It says in verse 4, "Then the presidents and the princes sought to find occasion against Daniel concerning the kingdom." Notice that. What did they seek to find issue with him about? The kingdom. So what do you have here? You have a group of men taking secret counsel together, planning and plotting how they may lay a trap for Daniel. That fits pretty well with Psalm chapter 64, doesn't it? But they sought to find something against the kingdom. It says that, but they could find none occasion nor fault. For as much as he was faithful, neither was there any error or fault found in him. What a good example. Listen, Daniel was faithful over the things that he had been put in charge of. When they looked at the rules of the land and the things that needed to be done, they couldn't find anything. Hey, guess what? Daniel wasn't skimming off of the top of any cash, right? Daniel wasn't lying about the amount of taxes coming in and skimming something off. Daniel wasn't casting out bad judgment. He wasn't taking advantage of people. He wasn't going behind the king's back, doing things he wasn't supposed to do. He was a good, upstanding, faithful servant of the king. That, listen, as we live our life, the things that we do, we need to make sure that we are being good, faithful, honest people. People that whenever they would say, well, let's find some fault against him about the kingdom, they couldn't, because he was being faithful. It says in verse 5, then said these men, we shall not find any occasion against this Daniel, except we find it against him concerning the law of his God. Now here's the second thing you need to notice. These people knew something about Daniel. They knew what was important to Daniel. This was not something that, like, Daniel never talked about God. Daniel never did anything that would reflect that he loved God, right? They knew by the interactions they'd had with Daniel, by watching his life and the things that he did, it was apparent that Daniel held great honor and respect for anything related to his God. And they said the only way we're going to get Daniel to go against the king is if it has to do with his God. What a great, great thing to say about somebody. And we desire and hope that we would be living a life that's like that, right? That people could see that God is important to us, that the laws of God are important to us, and that that is going to be something that we will hold firmly on, right? That's not something we're going to compromise. They knew by this point Daniel would not compromise when it came to the things of God. That is a great testimony. Now they're going to use that against him. It says in verse 6, then these presidents and princes assembled together to the king and said thus unto him, King Darius, live forever. And all the presidents of the kingdom, the governors and the princes, the counselors, the captains have consulted together to establish a royal statute and to make a firm decree that whosoever shall ask a petition of any god or man for 30 days, save of thee, O king, he shall be cast into the den of lions. Now, they know one thing about Daniel. Daniel prays to his God on a regular, consistent basis. They already knew that at this point. And they said, that's what we can do. We're going to go sweet talk the king. We're going to play to his pride. And we're going to say, we got this great idea. We think there should be this 30-day period of great honor to you where nobody can ask any god or anybody of anything except you. Right? I said this last week as we were hitting the summary of this. It cracks me up that they put a time limit on it, right? Because they didn't want to do it either. I mean, if we're honest, I'm sure that's what it was, right? Why not just say, hey, we can only make prayers and petitions to you, King? Why 30 days, right? Because they wanted a time limit on it, and they knew they only needed a little bit of time. Now, the king falls for this, which again is very fitting considering Psalm chapter 64, right? And I'm not saying Psalm 64 is about this. I'm saying this is an example of the type of thing that David knew God could do. And I believe had probably done it in David's life. These are good examples for us to look at. God had continued to do this in people's life. But listen, Psalm 64 talked about people that were whetting their swords. They were bending their bow. They were setting up an ambush. They were laying out a trap. Well, the first part of their trap has just sprung, and that was with the king. It says, "Now, O king, establish the decree and sign the writing, that it may not change according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which altereth not. Wherefore King Darius signed the writing and the decree." And then you see verse 10. "Now when Daniel knew that the writing was signed, he went into his house, and his windows being open in his chamber toward Jerusalem, he kneeled upon his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God, as he did aforetime." Now, anytime I teach out of Daniel chapter 6, I always draw people's attention to those words, "as he did aforetime." Because oftentimes, I especially see it sometimes, I feel like here in the U.S., it's almost like when a little bit of persecution comes, and I don't even really know that we can say we have persecution, but there starts to be some laws floated that would hinder us or look like they could hinder freedoms or things like that, right? Suddenly it's almost like people become more Christian than they were yesterday, right? And they're almost doing things out of, I'm going to show them they can't make me not do this, right? That's not the way it was with Daniel. Daniel didn't do anything different the day that was signed than he did the day before it was signed. Daniel was already praying to God 3 times a day. It was already something he did with his doors open, his windows open. Anybody that had access to view that could see it. He wasn't hiding it. Right? David, in other words, my point is David didn't have to change his life. Daniel, I keep saying David. Daniel didn't have to change his life to say, oh, hey, now I'm going to do what God wants me to do and I'm going to be going against what the king said. No. Daniel was already faithful to God, already serving God, already letting this world know that God was important to him. And the fact that a law got signed didn't change that. Now, I firmly believe that the Bible teaches that, we are supposed to try to live peaceably among men. It also teaches that we are supposed to hold those in positions of power in the government to some level of honor. We are supposed to try to obey the laws of the land. But there is example after example in the Bible where when that crosses over and the laws of the land go contrary to the will of God, then we are to serve God. And I'll stand here and say that all day long. I'm not afraid to do that. Now, thankfully, I don't feel like I have that problem. Some countries, they do. We may have that problem here at some point. But I trust that if that does ever come, we will have already been doing what God wants us to do faithfully, and that won't change the day something is signed. And he goes on in verse 11. Then these men assembled and found Daniel praying and making supplication before his God. Now that is no mistake. That is premeditated plotting, planning, and preparation, which fits pretty well with what Psalm 64 was describing, right? Premeditated, using their words, plotting, planning, laying out trips and traps. And they got Daniel. Honestly, they knew they would. I don't think this was a matter of, well, we hope this works. They knew it was going to work. And as soon as they could, they assembled together and they found, quote unquote, Daniel praying and making supplication before his God. In verse 12, then they came near and spake before the king concerning the king's decree. Hast thou not signed a decree that every man that shall ask a petition of any god or man within 30 days, save of thee, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions? The king answered and said, the thing is true, according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which altereth not. So they found Daniel. They did it, by the way, with a group of people. Why? Witnesses, right? Group of people found Daniel praying. Then they go to the king. I don't think, as you see here, they didn't lead Daniel up to him in chains. They came before the king and said, hey, king, didn't you sign a decree? Didn't you do this? Didn't it say this? Didn't it say the punishment of that is in the lion's den? Yes, That is true, and it can't be changed according to the rules of the Medes and the Persians. That's what the king said. At that point, it says in verse 13, then answered they and said before the king, that Daniel, which is of the children of the captivity of Judah, regardeth not thee, O king, nor the decree that thou hast signed, but maketh his petition 3 times a day. It says in verse 14, then the king, when he heard these words, was sore displeased with himself, and set his heart on Daniel to deliver him, and he labored till the going down of the sun to deliver him. It's almost as if when the words came out of their mouth, he thought, I should have known better. What was I doing? Of course Daniel was going to go pray to his God. He was displeased with himself, and he tried to do something about it. I don't know all the ifs, ands, or buts about it, but there seems to be some kind of indication that it wasn't going to be possible for him to change this based on the way that they had things laid out. In verse 15, then these men assembled unto the king and said unto the king, now, O king, that the law of the Medes and the Persians is that no decree nor statute which the king established may be changed. Then the king commanded, and they brought Daniel and cast him into the lion's den. And now the king spake and said unto Daniel, thy God, whom thou servest continually, he will deliver thee. Now, isn't that interesting? The king seems to have momentarily forgot about Daniel when he signed this decree. But as soon as he heard it, he was displeased with himself. He knew, yes, he didn't have to question it. Like, he knew they're right. He knew Daniel petitioned the Lord. And when he finally had to put him in the lion's den, he called out to Daniel, I know the God that you continually serve will deliver you. Listen, even the king knew Daniel's devotion to God. He referred to it as serving continually. In verse 17, and a stone was brought and laid upon the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet and with the signet of his lords, and the purpose might not be changed concerning Daniel. Then the king went to his palace and passed the night fasting. Neither were instruments of music brought before him, and his sleep went from him. Then the king arose very early in the morning, and he went in haste into the den of lions. And when he came to the den, he cried with a lamentable voice unto Daniel. And the king spake and said to Daniel, O Daniel, servant of the living God, is thy God, whom thou servest, continually able to deliver thee from the lions? Now, I don't know, he sounded more confident the night before, right? Surely the God that you continually serve will deliver you. Now when he comes back, he says it in a lamenting voice, and it's more of a question. He still talks about the fact that it is the God that he continually serves, but he cries out, is he able to deliver thee? And I don't know what his reaction, I would have loved to have seen his facial expression when verse 21 happens. Then said Daniel unto the king, O king, live forever. My God has sent his angels and has shut the lions' mouths, that they have not hurt me, for as much as before him innocency was found in me, and also before thee, O king, have I done no hurt. I have not sinned against God, and I have not sinned against you, king. And the Lord has protected me. The Lord has kept me. So the king cries out, and the king hears a response. And it's got to be an overwhelming experience. I mean, how many people can be thrown into a den of lions with a stone put over it where there's no escape, and you come back the next day and he's totally fine? It says then, as you go down through here, he says in verse 23, Then was the king exceeding glad for him, and commanded that they should take Daniel up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no manner of hurt was found upon him, because he believed in his God. That idea there is he had faith in God, and God protected him. What is it, the song we sang? Victory ahead, right? He prayed knowing what the ramifications were, but knowing that that's what God wanted him to do, and he was going to trust and believe God no matter where it led. And in this case, the Lord delivered. Verse 24, And the king commanded, and they brought those men which had accused Daniel, And they cast them into the den of lions, them, their children, their wives, and the lions had the mastery of them and brake all their bones in pieces or ever they came at the bottom of the den. I talked about in Psalm chapter 64, you see the idea that those that have laid the traps, those that have sent out the bitter words, those that have plotted and planned and are setting an ambush, that God turned the tables in Psalm chapter 64, and God let loose His arrow. And when His arrow struck, that sword that they had been so intently sharpening actually cut them. That's exactly what happened here. They wanted Daniel gone. They wanted him in the lion's den. And in the end, Daniel survived, and they took his place in the lion's den and didn't survive. Listen, the Lord can totally take things and make them turn out totally different than what this world plans. He goes on. It says, Then King Darius wrote unto all people, nations, and languages that dwell in all the earth, Peace be multiplied unto you. I make a decree that in every dominion of my kingdom men tremble and fear before the God of Daniel. For He is the living God and steadfast forever, and His kingdom that which shall not be destroyed, and His dominion shall be even unto the end. He delivereth and rescueth. He worketh signs and wonders in heaven and in earth. Who hath delivered Daniel from the power of the lion? So this Daniel prospered in the reign of Darius and in the reign of Cyrus the Persian. Now, I mentioned that not only have we already hit multiple places where this is a really good example of what happened in Psalm chapter 64, but even the way this ends matches up with what you see in Psalm chapter 64. Because when those that were wicked and plotted and planned and were laying an ambush, when the tables were turned on them, what happened? What happened? People took notice. It says in Psalm chapter 64, So they shall make their own tongue to fall upon themselves. This is verse 8. All that see them shall flee away. Verse 9. And all men shall fear and declare the work of God, for they shall wisely consider of His doing. That's what Darius did. Darius saw it. He saw what happened. He saw what God had delivered, and he took notice of it. He considered it, and he feared God. And what did he do? He sent word out to all of his dominions, all the places that he had the rule of. He said, listen, this God of Daniel is a God to be feared, because this is a God that delivers His people. That's exactly what Psalm 64 said would happen. When the tables are turned and the trap is sprung on those that set the trap, people are going to say, look at what God did. Look at what God did. And that's exactly what happened in here. And then it says, verse 28, So this Daniel prospered in the reign of Darius and in the reign of Cyrus the Persian. What happens in verse 10 of Psalm chapter 64? The righteous shall be glad in the Lord and shall trust in Him, and all the upright in heart shall glory. The righteous are going to continue to trust and serve God, and they're going to see blessings from the things that the Lord has done for them. And so I really, as we studied Daniel here in Daniel chapter 6 and the story of him in the lion's den, I just thought it matched up so well to Psalm chapter 64. Right? Now I'm sure David was writing this probably about something that happened in his own life. When you read David's writings, listen, they are drawn from so much personal experience. But David was also, I don't know if this was prophecy, but David was a prophet. And it's just interesting to me that this fits so well into multiple things that did happen down the road. Esther's a perfect fit. Daniel's a perfect fit. You could even argue that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were perfect fits, right? The people that threw them in to the furnace died. Now, the guy that commanded it, that maybe not have right then, right? But man, the Lord can take things and He can just turn them around. He doesn't do it every time. The Lord's plans, we don't know all of the ins and outs of everything that God has. There have been times where God didn't move the way that he did in Daniel's situation. He handles it some other way. Listen, there's been times in our own life where God has done things and we did not see how it could turn out, and it did. And there's other times where, you know what, we had to weather the storm. And God didn't remove something from us. He didn't remove an obstacle from us. But usually, when we look back on it, he taught us some things through it. So sometimes God is teaching us some things, and sometimes God is laying out a plan for somebody else. Maybe what you're going through, it may be for you, but you know what? Maybe it's for somebody that's watching you. Maybe it's for somebody that's watching you. Maybe it's for the Dariuses of this world to go, man, what he's been saying about God is right. I don't know. I don't know what God has planned for each of us. But I do know that what we're supposed to do is we're supposed to trust him, faithfully serve him. Whether that means that what I could do yesterday and not get in trouble, today I got to make a decision. If I do this, I'm going to get in trouble, but this is what God wants me to do. I pray that we have the strength and the courage to do it, right? I pray that before we ever get to that point, we're already living a life that people are going, man, there is something about that God that they serve, right? And then when the Lord does things in your life, people can go, wow, he was right. Man, there is something different about the God that he serves. I think about, me and Tanya were talking about David earlier today because of some things that have come out and some other things. You know, David's sin is as much remembered as David's faithfulness to God. Your testimony is important. Hey, listen, people remember that David was a great king. People remember that David was faithful to the Lord. They remember that David loved the Lord. But unfortunately, you can't hardly talk about David and not talk about this big, giant, glaring thing that happened in his life. We need to be faithful. Because we can either be a Daniel, when people said there's only one way we're going to get him to fall, and that's by tricking him with his God, or stumbling, causing him to stumble, because he won't back down from that. Or we can let sin creep into our lives, and people will have something to accuse us about. So people will have something to lay at our feet. I'm thankful to know that when they tried with Daniel, they couldn't find anything. Daniel wasn't perfect. We know that. There was no perfect person other than the Lord Jesus Christ. But Daniel stood firm. And we need to stand firm. And we need to be guarded. Daniel was able to do what Daniel did because he trusted the Lord and because he was consistent about it. Right? You see, early in his life, he had a path he could take. I can go do this, or I can go say, hey, that's not right for us to do, and I want to stand firm even now, even early, even when I'm young, even when it comes to a matter of what I can eat or not eat. Daniel showed consistently that he wanted to do what God wanted him to do, and that's what we need to do. All right, we're going to go ahead and be done.